At 9:17 a.m. on January 22, 1943, First Lieutenant John George was hiding in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. He peered carefully through his scope, aiming at a massive banyan tree about 220 meters away. For the past 6 weeks, his fellow soldiers had constantly joked about his rifle. At 27 years old, George was the Illinois state shooting champion, yet he had never killed an enemy in combat. At that time, the Japanese had around 11 snipers operating in the forests around Point Cruz. In just the previous 72 hours, they had taken 14 American soldiers from the 132nd Infantry Regiment out of action. George's commanding officer once called his rifle a child's toy, while other platoon leaders joked that it was his girlfriend. When George opened the case containing his Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount at Camp Forest, Tennessee, a gunsmith jokingly asked whether it was meant for hunting deer or Germans. George replied that it was for the Japanese. However, an ironic setback followed. When the unit received sudden orders to deploy to the Pacific, George's Winchester was still being shipped back to Illinois for final tuning by the gunsmith. He had no choice but to board the transport ship empty-handed. During the long journey to Guadalcanal, while his comrades cleaned their standard-issue Garand rifles, the weapon George had saved 2 years of pay to buy sat untouched in a warehouse back home. Refusing to give up, George filed paperwork to have the rifle sent through military mail. After 6 weeks at sea, in late December 1942, a logistics sergeant finally delivered a sealed wooden crate marked "Fragile." Compared to the standard semi-automatic M1 Garand, the Winchester Model 70 was a high-end civilian hunting rifle. It required manual loading but offered near-perfect accuracy. Although it weighed about 4.5 kilograms, its margin of error was extremely low, around 3 centimeters at 100 meters, thanks to its strong bolt-action system and 60-centimeter barrel. This exceptional long-range performance was why George insisted on bringing his companion into combat, even when it went against orders to use standard military weapons. The 132nd Infantry Regiment replaced the U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had been fighting since August, capturing Henderson Field and holding it, but they had not fully secured Mount Austin or the coastal forests west of the Guadalcanal River. Mount Austin rose over 460 meters high and was known to the Japanese as GEU. It was defended by about 500 soldiers and 47 reinforced bunkers. George's battalion began its assault on December 17th and endured 16 days of brutal fighting, losing 34 men killed and 279 wounded before capturing the western slope on January 2. By that time, George had still not fired a single shot in combat with his Winchester. It remained a silent companion, waiting for the moment it would finally prove its worth on the battlefield. Facing George were seasoned Japanese snipers, extremely patient and intimately familiar with every meter of the jungle terrain. They were armed with Arisaka rifles fitted with Tokiwa 4X scopes, which offered greater magnification than the scope on Winchester. Although both rifles used bolt-action mechanisms, the Arisaka was lighter at about 3.8 kilograms, had a longer 66-centimeter barrel, and fired 7.7 millimeter ammunition well suited to East Asian battlefield conditions. It was a weapon designed for accurate medium-range fire, simple to operate, yet deadly effective. This combination of skilled soldiers, capable weapons, and unforgiving terrain turned the enemy into a serious threat, forcing George and his comrades into a fight for survival, where even the smallest mistake could cost a life. Their presence became a living nightmare. On January 19th, a hidden sniper killed Corporal Davis as he went to fetch water. On January 20th, 2 more soldiers from Company L were killed while on patrol. On January 21st, 3 additional men were taken out of action. That evening, the battalion commander summoned George. Japanese snipers were inflicting severe casualties on the unit. Some officers believed they were even more frightening than jungle malaria. When asked to prove the effectiveness of his civilian Winchester, George presented the commander with his impressive personal shooting records. At just 23 years old, George had made history by becoming the youngest Illinois state champion in 1939, with confirmed hits at distances of up to 900 meters. He stood out not only for his titles, but for his near-perfect accuracy. Using iron sights, George could group his shots within 15 centimeters at 550 meters. With the Lyman scope attached, his performance was even more remarkable. All 5 rounds landing within a 10-centimeter circle at 275 meters. Despite these undeniable numbers, the commander remained cautious. He gave George until the following morning to prove that skill on the shooting range could hold up against the brutal reality of combat. A deadly duel between George's Winchester and the Japanese Arisaka snipers was about to begin. To keep us motivated to dig deeper into forgotten historical records, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. As for George, he stayed awake most of the night tending to his Winchester Model 70. After the long sea voyage, he carefully removed the protective grease, inspected every mechanical component, and paid special attention to the scope's stability, making sure it would not shift after each shot.
George refused to rely on luck. Instead of using standard-issue ammunition, he personally selected the finest .30-06 Springfield rounds available. With 150-grain bullets and a muzzle velocity of about 850 meters per second, this ammunition provided a stable and consistent flight path, allowing him to fully exploit the advantages of the rifle's 60-centimeter barrel. At first light on January 22nd, George quietly took up a position inside an old Japanese bunker overlooking the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. He began scanning the towering banyan trees, some reaching heights of up to 27 meters, where Japanese snipers often concealed themselves before dawn to hunt American soldiers. George moved into position alone, carrying his Winchester, a canteen, and 60 rounds of spare ammunition. He lay completely still, watching through his Lyman Alaskan scope. Although its 2.5 times magnification was modest, the Lyman's glass was clear enough to detect subtle, unnatural movements in the dark canopy. Amid the constant noise of the jungle, George focused with total concentration, methodically sweeping the area in a grid pattern to ensure no gap went unchecked. At 9:17 a.m., he noticed a branch moving unnaturally about 26 meters up a banyan tree roughly 200 meters away. Through the scope, the outline of a Japanese sniper became clear at a fork in the branches, his rifle aimed toward the American supply route. George gently adjusted the scope's windage knob to compensate for a light breeze coming from the right. He relaxed his body, settled into a steady breathing rhythm, and held his breath at the end of his exhale to keep the rifle perfectly still. The trigger of the Model 70, carefully tuned to a very light pull during training at Camp Perry, broke smoothly under his fingertip. George squeezed the trigger. A sharp crack rang out, and the Winchester nudged lightly against his shoulder. From over 200 meters away, the enemy sniper was struck and vanished into the dense canopy. George immediately worked the bolt, a brass casing flying free as a fresh round slid into the chamber in an instant. His eyes never left the target area, ready for any further threat. It was a defining moment when a civilian rifle, guided by skill and calm discipline, proved its true worth on the battlefield by defeating a well-trained enemy. But it was not over. Japanese snipers often operated in pairs, one shooter and one observer. If George had just eliminated the primary gunman, the second was likely still nearby, possibly in the same tree or a neighboring one, silently watching and waiting for a chance to strike back. George slowly scanned the surrounding banyan trees. The scope demanded patience. The jungle created overlapping shadows where shapes could easily deceive the eye without absolute focus. At around 9:43 a.m., he detected another unnatural movement. The second sniper was in a different tree, not far away, positioned several dozen meters lower than the first. The Japanese soldier was clearly attempting to withdraw after hearing the earlier shot. George kept his breathing steady and locked onto the moving target. A single, clean shot shattered the jungle's silence. The enemy's body fell backward, and his Arisaka rifle tumbled after him, disappearing into the thick layer of leaves below. 2 shots, 2 targets. George reloaded from the stripper clip, his hands steady and his breathing calm. It felt like a shooting competition at Camp Perry, except this time the targets could shoot back.
At 11:21 a.m., a Japanese round slammed into the sandbags just 15 centimeters from George's head, sending dust flying. He rolled to the left and pressed himself tightly against the bunker wall. The shot came from the southwest, different from the previous 2. George waited exactly 3 minutes, long enough to disrupt the enemy's reaction rhythm, then eased back into position and shifted his focus to the southwest. By basic sniper doctrine, a shooter would relocate after being exposed, especially after a missed shot, but in this dense jungle, there were very few options. At 11:38 a.m., he noticed something unusual. In the third tree of a cluster of 5 banyans, about 22 meters above the ground, a human shape remained almost perfectly still. The enemy had changed branches, but stayed on the same tree trunk, a delayed decision and a fatal mistake. George controlled his breathing and locked on to the faint silhouette in the shadows. A short crack echoed. The dark shape dropped silently, blending into the leaf-covered ground below. By noon, George had taken down 5 enemy soldiers. Word spread quickly. Those who had once mocked him now gathered, curious to watch him work, but George refused. The presence of a crowd would expose his position to enemy fire. After these losses, the Japanese became more cautious and stopped moving during daylight hours. George continued to observe patiently throughout the afternoon, but found no further targets. At 4 p.m., he returned to headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting, his attitude completely changed. Without a trace of mockery, he formally ordered George to continue the mission at first light the next morning. January 23rd began with heavy jungle rain, reducing visibility to less than 90 meters. It was not until 9:12 a.m., when the rain eased, that George could observe again. At 9:12 a.m., he spotted a Japanese sniper at a distance of 265 meters, much farther than the previous day's targets, a clear sign the enemy was now wary of his effective range. George calmly calculated the bullet drop at roughly 25 centimeters and squeezed the trigger, eliminating his 6th target. Immediately afterward, the Japanese launched a mortar counterattack to suppress George's firing position. After 2 rounds exploded nearby, George grabbed his rifle and dove into a bomb crater just before the bunker was completely destroyed. He quickly relocated to a fallen tree 110 meters away to set up a new position. The fight had now turned into a deadly battle of wits, with Japanese soldiers actively hunting him. Under the suffocating pressure of combat, the skill of a seasoned marksman truly emerged. George patiently tracked even the smallest enemy movements. At 2:23 p.m., he precisely eliminated his 7th target. He pressed on, exploiting the changing angle of the afternoon sun, when shifting shadows began to betray hidden positions. Thanks to this awareness, by 3:41 p.m., he had taken down his 8th target, completing the mission under extreme conditions.
Late in the afternoon, as George attempted to reposition once more, a sharp crack echoed from the distance. A 6.5mm Arisaka round, known for its high muzzle velocity, tore through George's right leg.
Pain surged, but with the discipline of a professional soldier, George made no sound. He immediately carried out a tactical self-aid procedure within the brush to prevent shock from blood loss. The wound weakened George rapidly. His vision began to blur from exhaustion, but a soldier's will drove him not to collapse. He knew that if he stopped, the snipers still hidden out there would remain a direct threat to the entire unit. Summoning extraordinary determination, George used his Winchester as a crutch and dragged himself meter by meter through the dense jungle, searching for a way back to friendly lines. Every movement was a brutal struggle against pain, yet his thoughts were fixed on one thing alone, the safety of his comrades. When he finally reached his fellow soldiers and was carried to a field aid station, his breathing was shallow, but he still forced out a warning. "There are still 3 left. I have to go back." Those words were more than speech. They were the oath of a soldier who never abandoned his mission. At the end of the second day, George reported to Captain Morris, 8 enemy targets eliminated with just 12 rounds fired. Faced with this astonishing efficiency, he was ordered to continue the mission at first light the next day. That night, George maintained his weapon and took stock. Of the original 11 Japanese snipers, 8 had been eliminated. Only the 3 toughest remained. He knew these survivors were master marksmen who were now fully aware of his presence and of the Winchester. He loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to rest beneath the jungle rain before dawn. He chose a new firing position at a cluster of rocks that had once housed a Marine machine gun nest, offering better cover and a wider field of view than his previous location. At 8:17 a.m. on January 24th, as the rain eased, George spotted a Japanese sniper in a palm tree 175 meters away, only about 12 meters above the ground. But instead of firing, he hesitated. For someone who had survived 3 days of sniper hunting, exposing himself so low and carelessly made no sense, unless it was a decoy. Trusting his instincts he had honed as a competitive marksman, he widened his scan to find the true hunter. 11 minutes later, he detected a target 28 meters up a banyan tree, 73 meters to the northwest. The man was heavily camouflaged on 3 sides, yet had a clear line of sight toward the fallen tree position George had used the day before. George was in a deadly bind. Killing the camouflaged sniper at such close range would produce a sharp rifle crack, instantly revealing his position to the remaining enemy. George chose to turn the trap back on them. He fired first, killing the decoy in the palm tree, then immediately swung the rifle toward the banyan. Just as expected, the sharp report of the Winchester caused the real sniper to shift slightly as he tried to locate the muzzle flash. George fired his second shot before the enemy could react. 2 targets fell in seconds, but his position was now fully exposed. George bolted, diving into a rocky gully nearly 40 meters away just as Japanese machine gun fire tore into his former position. After escaping the gunfire, George crawled another 90 meters to a bomb crater filled with chest-deep water and took cover. At 9:47 a.m., he realized a flaw in his earlier assumptions. The final sniper was not in a tree. Through his scope, George spotted a figure crawling low through brush just 55 meters away. The man moved with extreme professionalism, following the exact withdrawal route George himself had used earlier. As the enemy closed in on George's old rock position at 10:03 a.m., George prepared to fire, then stopped. A veteran like this would never carelessly turn his back so easily. Holding his breath, George expanded his scan and uncovered a terrifying truth. A second Japanese sniper was hidden 65 meters away, his rifle already trained on the rocky gully, where George should have been hiding. The 2 were working together, laying a trap. With the bolt-action Winchester, George knew he could not eliminate both targets fast enough before being killed. He submerged himself in the murky water, exposing only his eyes and the rifle barrel. silently waiting for even the smallest opening. At 10:13 a.m., the man on the rock stood up after 10 minutes of seeing nothing, assuming George had moved east. He signaled to his partner, and the two advanced eastward, about 65 meters, sweeping the area. George remained perfectly still. They passed the crater without noticing him, their backs exposed. George rose smoothly, aimed at the nearer man 38 meters away, and fired. The enemy fell. He worked the bolt, swung to the second sniper as the man turned and raised his rifle. George fired first. 11 shots over 3 days, 11 snipers eliminated. George had neutralized the threat responsible for the deaths of 14 American soldiers in just 72 hours. But as he climbed out of the crater to collect the spent brass, he heard voices, Japanese voices, coming from the jungle. More men were approaching. He had eliminated the snipers, but they had not been operating alone. George slipped back into the cold, muddy water, leaving only his eyes above the surface, rifle held steady. By 10:28 a.m., the Japanese troops began moving toward the hiding place. They followed boot prints pressed into the mud, leading from the rocky outcrop straight to where George lay concealed. The distance was closing, and the confrontation was about to enter a far more dangerous phase. 5 rounds in the rifle against an encircling infantry group was a deadly imbalance. George faced 2 choices: stay hidden and wait, or strike first. Enemy footsteps closed in, 20 meters, then 15. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the edge of the bomb crater, his eyes locking onto George's. George fired instantly from beneath the water. The man collapsed. George worked the bolt underwater, surged up, and shot 2 more soldiers who rushed in moments later. All 3 were down. He now had only 3 rounds left.
Shouts erupted as more Japanese infantry converged. George burst out of the crater, sprinted north, and took cover behind a fallen tree. Arisaka rifle fire and Nambu machine gun fire swept violently across his escape route. Staying low, George scanned through the scope and spotted 2 soldiers advancing at about 45 meters. He dropped the lead man, forcing the second to dive for cover. The magazine now held only 2 rounds. Hearing den fire closing in from the south and east, George knew a manually loaded rifle could not withstand superior numbers armed with machine guns and grenades. He chose to withdraw, crashing through dense brush as thorns whipped his face, bullets shredding tree trunks around him. After more than a minute racing death, George dove into a dry earthen gully and pressed himself against the dirt wall, listening to his own breathing merge with the sounds of the jungle. The Japanese voices faded, likely stopping to recover their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud coated the stock and water seeped from the barrel. At 10:47, he began moving low, using every fold of terrain to make his way back toward the American defensive line. The jungle grew eerily quiet, broken only by distant artillery. At 11:13, after giving the correct password at a checkpoint, George safely rejoined his unit. He reported to Captain Morris 11 snipers eliminated over 4 days with 12 rounds fired, 11 confirmed hits. In the final infantry encounter, he had killed 3 more with 3 rounds. Morris looked at the Winchester, caked in mud, and ordered George to rest. He then delivered important news. Japanese forces were withdrawing from Guadalcanal. Point Cruz was no longer a hot zone. George returned to his tent and spent more than 2 hours carefully stripping the rifle, cleaning off salt water and mud with specialized oil to protect the barrel from the brutal tropical corrosion. Only then did he reload 5 fresh rounds for whatever missions might follow. At 2 p.m., orders came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. On the walk over, George assumed Morris had filed an unfavorable report: unauthorized engagements, excessive ammunition use, independent action. Instead, when he entered the room, George found Morris standing with 2 senior officers, including Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. The atmosphere was nothing like he had expected.
Colonel Ferry looked directly at George and asked simply, "Can you train others to do this?" George thought for a moment, then answered honestly. He said he could try, but it would take time, scoped rifles, and soldiers who already had solid shooting fundamentals. Not everyone could do it, but it was possible. Ferry explained that the division had 14 Springfield M1903 rifles fitted with inertial scopes, sniper weapons left behind by the Marines, and 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to form a sniper unit, train them, and develop tactics to eliminate remaining Japanese snipers. George agreed, on the condition that he keep his Winchester. Ferry approved. George kept the Winchester. The 14 Springfields went to the men he trained. Training began on January 27th with 40 soldiers at a temporary range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. They were strong in theory and accurate with iron sights out to 460 meters, but had no real sniper combat experience and had never fired from concealment at a live enemy.
George taught the fundamentals: breath control, smooth trigger pull, and reading wind through leaves and brush. With the Springfield, he emphasized using improvised support, rocks, logs, sandbags, because the jungle rarely offered perfect firing positions and adaptation was essential. Training lasted 3 days. First, static targets at 90 to 365 meters, then moving targets, then partially concealed ones. By January 30th, 32 men achieved high hit rates on man-sized targets at 275 meters in field conditions. George organized them into 16 two-man teams, 1 shooter and 1 observer. The observer carried binoculars and a garand to spot targets and provide security. The shooter focused solely on firing. Roles rotated to maintain balanced skills and prevent failure from individual dependency. On February 1st, George led 4 teams into the area west of the Matanaku River, where intelligence reported that a group of Japanese soldiers had been left behind and had not yet withdrawn. Before dawn, all 4 teams took up their positions and waited patiently. George worked alongside Sergeant Hayes, choosing high ground that overlooked an enemy supply trail. At 7:20 a.m., a figure appeared. Hayes confirmed the target. George squeezed the trigger. The Japanese soldier fell, and the jungle went silent again. They continued to observe, but no immediate movement followed. Over the next 6 hours, George's team eliminated 7 more enemies. Of 8 shots fired, 6 hit their targets. 1 missed due to a sudden shift in the wind. The other 3 teams achieved similar results. By the end of the day, a total of 23 Japanese soldiers had been taken out of action, with no American casualties. The unit continued operations into early February. By February 9th, the teams had eliminated 74 Japanese soldiers. Japanese forces accelerated their withdrawal, with destroyers evacuating them at night from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American units pushed west to intercept, but Japanese rearguards fought effectively. George's unit was tasked with eliminating the covering forces protecting the retreat. On February 7th, near the Tanambogo River, a Japanese soldier shot George in the left shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Hayes dragged him into cover and called for a medic. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field, where doctors cleaned and stitched the wound and ordered him to rest for 3 weeks with no combat duty. During George's 2 weeks in the hospital, Japanese forces completed their withdrawal from Guadalcanal on February 9th. American troops reached Cape Esperance and found the area empty. The campaign was over. George's unit had operated for 12 days, confirming 74 enemy killed with no sniper casualties. The division formally recognized the unit. Colonel Ferry recommended George for the Bronze Star. But his war was not yet finished.
While still in the hospital, orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced officers for a new mission in Burma, classified and high risk. George volunteered. By March, he boarded a ship heading west across the Pacific, his Winchester sealed in a waterproof case in the hold, the limanscope wrapped in oilcloth. He knew little about Burma, only that it meant jungle warfare, deep patrols, and operations behind enemy lines, conditions where a marksman capable of accurate fire at 550 meters could be invaluable. The ship arrived in India on April 3. George and 200 officers received a briefing. They were joining a new force of 3,000 men, not yet officially named, provisionally called Merrill's Marauders. The 5307th Composite Unit was officially formed on May 28, 1943, though training had begun in April. The focus was on deep penetration, jungle survival, and long-duration operations without continuous logistical support. The model was based on the British Chindits, small, mobile units operating for extended periods behind enemy lines. George was assigned as a rifle platoon leader in the 2nd Battalion, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation ensured commanders recognized his exceptional skill with the rifle. Training moved to a base in India. The terrain differed from Guadalcanal, but the core principles remained the same. Hot, humid climate, dense jungle, short sight lines, and constant visual deception. Burma's jungle, however, was far harsher, steeper slopes, prolonged heavy rains, and an enemy who knew the ground intimately. George adjusted his equipment for the new reality. He replaced the limanscope with a Weaver 330, about 0.2 kilograms lighter while retaining the same 2.5 times magnification, more than sufficient for jungle combat. The wooden stock was also replaced with a lighter synthetic material, more durable in constant moisture. These changes reduced the rifle's total weight from 4.4 kilograms to 4 kilograms. On paper, the difference seemed small, but during long patrols, when each soldier carried up to 27 kilograms of gear, it mattered immensely. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944, tasked with advancing north to seize the Michiana airfield, a critical hub for supply routes into China. The Japanese defended it with roughly 4,000 troops. The Marauders marched through terrain the Japanese believed impassable: high mountains, major rivers, dense jungle, and no roads. They carried everything on their backs or with pack mules, no vehicles, no heavy artillery, only small arms and mortars, moving fast through brutal terrain. George's battalion set out on February 24th. In the first week, they covered 133 kilometers of jungle and mountains. Many men collapsed from exhaustion, malaria spread rapidly, and injured pack animals had to be dealt with. By March, they had covered a total of 349 kilometers and encountered Japanese forces 12 times, mostly small firefights, quick ambushes, and immediate withdrawals. The Marauders did not hold ground. They disrupted supply lines, harassed the enemy, and created chaos deep behind Japanese lines. George used the Winchester 3 times in Burma, once at 375 meters to kill a Japanese non-commissioned officer commanding troops across a river, the bullet passing cleanly through riverbank cover with precisely calculated drop. Once at 350 meters to neutralize a machine gun position by killing the primary gunner, and once at 265 meters to eliminate a sniper pinning down a patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. He never fired twice in the same engagement. The distinctive crack of the Winchester would reveal his position, so he fired once and moved immediately. The march toward Michiana lasted 3 months and covered more than 1,100 kilometers. Most losses came from disease, malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever. The force shrank from 5,300 men to less than 3,000 combat-effective troops. On May 17th, they captured the airfield, a major success, but at terrible cost. The unit was nearly combat ineffective.
George survived, and so did the Winchester, but the rifle from Guadalcanal was used only 7 times during those 3 months. Combat with the Marauders was mostly close range, ambushes at 45 meters, firefights in dense jungle where visibility dropped below 9 meters. George realized that warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming the standard, and future campaigns would demand more flexible weapons. There was no immediate follow-on mission for George. In June 1944, he was evacuated from Burma along with the Marauders, and the unit was disbanded. George returned to the United States to serve as a trainer. He would never again use the Winchester in combat. Back in the U.S. in July 1944, the Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia, where he trained officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught lessons drawn from Guadalcanal and Burma, jungle movement, long-range target engagement, and independent operations without higher-level support. George kept the Winchester with him from Illinois to Tennessee, Guadalcanal, India, Burma, and finally, Georgia. It had accounted for at least 14 confirmed enemy kills, likely more. He stopped counting after Burma. The rifle sat quietly in a locker, rarely handled. The war had changed. Pacific Islands were retaken. American forces advanced through France and into Germany. The need for individual soldiers carrying personal weapons declined as the Army standardized equipment, mass-produced arms, and trained soldiers uniformly. George understood the necessity. Modern war was industrial, but something was lost: individual skill, craftsmanship, and the idea that one person with the right rifle and training could alter the course of a battle. George left the Army in January 1947 with the rank of lieutenant colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantryman Badge. He returned to Illinois and studied at Princeton under the GI Bill, majoring in political science and graduating with honors in 1950. He then spent 4 years at Oxford, followed by 4 years in British East Africa studying regional politics. Eventually, he settled in Washington, D.C., serving as director of the African American Institute and later as an advisor and lecturer at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute on African Affairs. George rarely spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific, but not about Point Cruz, the Japanese snipers, or the Winchester stored in a case at his home. In 1947, while his memories were still fresh, George wrote detailed notes, never intended for publication, on weapons and jungle warfare tactics. He wrote for 6 months, producing a manuscript of over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and suggested publication. George hesitated. The book was technical, focused on firearms, ammunition, and ballistics, not mass appeal. But the NRA persuaded him, and the book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. The book accurately described his experiences in Guadalcanal and Burma, no exaggeration, only clear-eyed accounts of both effectiveness and limitations. It remains in print today, and is still referenced by collectors and historians studying individual small arms in World War II. At the time, its descriptions of Japanese weapons were among the most detailed available.
George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched infantry weapons evolve from the Garand to the M14 and then the M16. Sniping became a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment. Lessons from World War II were relearned and refined by later generations. John George passed away on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. His Winchester Model 70, the rifle that had brought down Japanese snipers at Guadalcanal, is now displayed at the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It rests in a glass case with a brief historical plaque. Most visitors walk past without stopping, seeing only an old hunting rifle. But to those who know the story, it is more than a weapon. It is a symbol of perseverance, individual skill, and the will to endure in the darkest moments of war. When I think about John George, I can't help but feel deeply moved. He was a pride of America, a regular young man from Illinois who loved firearms and trusted his own skill, yet became a legend on the battlefield. During those long days at Point Cruz, when fellow soldiers were falling to Japanese snipers, George wasn't shooting just to survive. He was shooting to protect his brothers and to give his unit hope. He proved that one man with the right rifle, steady hands, and a brave heart, could change the course of a fight. But what truly touches the heart of his story is his quiet faith. John George never bragged or spoke at length about his precise shots. He often said that in his loneliest moments, lying still in the jungle, he prayed, asking God for calm, accuracy, and the strength to protect those he cared about. He believed it wasn't his skill or his rifle that saved him, but God's grace guiding every bullet. In Shots Fired in Anger, he wrote simply, "When I aimed, I wasn't just looking through the scope. I felt an unseen hand guiding me." John George was not a superhero. He was an ordinary man who, through faith and courage, did extraordinary things. Today, as we retell his story, let us remember this: true heroes don't need glory. They only need a heart that loves their comrades and faith in God to carry them through the darkness. Thank you, Lieutenant John George, pride of America and living proof that even in the harshest war, faith and courage can still shine. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please help by pressing like. Every like helps YouTube share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from old archives every day, stories of marksmen who proved themselves through skill and courage, true heroes. Leave a comment below the video. Where are you watching from? The US? The UK? Canada? Australia? Our community spans the globe. You're not just watching, you're keeping memory alive. Share where you're from, whether you have family who served, or simply say hello. Thank you for watching and for helping ensure that John George is not forgotten. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are part of that.